All right. So, hello and welcome to our second session of the day. Embrace a strong culture of food safety. I'm Tiffany Leon, and I'll be your moderator for this session. So, today we're grateful to be joined by Patrick Guzzle from the National Restaurant Association, and I will let him take it from here.
Well, thank you so much, Tiffany. I appreciate the time to be with you all to talk about food allergens. This is a topic that is, gaining more and more importance. A little bit about me, as you can see on the screen, I am the Vice President of Food Science with the National Restaurant Association. Food science encompasses a lot of different things, of course, in food safety, but we also look at things that go beyond the traditional definition of food safety. So when we think about food safety, a lot of times we think about cooking temperatures and holding temperatures and hand washing and things like this, but we're also trying to go beyond what does that mean. And so I'm so appreciative to be invited to speak with you today. A little bit about my background. I have worked in food safety for over 20 years now. Most of that time was in a regulatory capacity. I was over a state food safety program for many, many years. I reside in and work from my home in Boise, Idaho. So I was over the Idaho food safety program for several years. A couple of years ago, I had an opportunity to join with the National Restaurant Association. So that's where I am now. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. On this slide, probably every single one of you in the audience is well familiar with these numbers, and I don't need to repeat them, but we know that food allergies impact a lot of people, 32 million people approximately in the US. And this actually extends to myself now. I have two family members who have experienced rather severe food allergies. I'll share some of those experiences with you later today or later in this presentation and what we do at home to try to manage those allergens. And again, a lot of this is geared towards a restaurant setting, but I'm hopeful that we can apply what we're talking about today to any different setting that we may find ourselves in. This slide was actually shared with me by a colleague, and what really stuck in my mind about this slide is the quote in the teal font from a parent talking about food allergens. "It is emotionally exhausting, never out of my mind." And that made me stop and think, wow, one of our kids was diagnosed with a food allergy when he was 5 years old. And when he was younger, we really had to help him manage that. And as he got older, he understood how to manage it himself. And so I can kind of relate to this emotionally exhausting, never out of my mind. I'll share with you a couple of experiences. One right now, when this young man, he's 26 years old now, but when he was about 8 or 9 years old, he was in Cub Scouts, and somebody brought some brownies to a Cub Scout function, and he had some, and then he realized that there were some crushed walnuts on the top of these brownies, and his allergy is tree nuts. And he was pretty emotionally upset. And so he rubbed his eyes because he was starting to cry, and his eyes ended up swelling shut. And it turns out that he didn't ingest any of the walnuts, but he had touched the brownies, and the fingers contact on the brownie, and then his eyes made him have a reaction with his eyes. And so I can certainly understand where people talk about this never out of my mind. This slide is only my opinion. I have, except for the third bullet point, I'll talk about that. But the first two bullet points are only my opinion. I am not a medical doctor. I am not here to try to make a diagnosis, nor am I here to give any medical advice. So only my opinion. Are we seeing more food allergies being diagnosed now than we were when I was a kid? I grew up in the 1970s. In my opinion, probably not, but we are seeing better detection and more information available that helps us better understand and react to those allergen situations. I am a member of the Conference for Food Protection. This is a volunteer organization that, if you think of it this way, it's kind of, in a way, it's a steering organization for the FDA Model Food Code. The Conference for Food Protection consists of regulators, industry professionals, academia, consumer groups. And what we do is we take food safety issues and we try to make recommendations to the FDA on what they should do with that particular issue that we've debated and deliberated. I do know that the Conference for Food Protection, through various committees that they have established over the last few years, the conference does continue to work on food allergens, cross contact, and related topics so that we can continue to get more updated and better information. So I'm talking about better information and more information. For me, when I think about food allergens, the real critical element comes down to communication and the importance that communication plays with this. Part of that communication is to anticipate potential concerns and potential issues with food allergens. When I speak to restaurants about this, I tell them, don't ever wait for an official declaration of what an allergen is. If you have a guest who expresses that they experience a food allergy, you need to treat that order with the appropriate care. Most importantly, you need to treat the guest with the dignity that he or she deserves. Also, when I speak to restaurants, I tell them to keep allergens as a front of mind issue for everyone and to try to help anticipate potential concerns. So here's really two examples of what I mean by trying to anticipate potential concerns and not waiting for official declarations. The first example I get from a colleague of mine who used to work with the Disney organization. And according to my colleague, anytime you go to a Disney park, you are never more than 19 steps away from a garbage can. The reason why is because, according to my colleague, Walt Disney, when he was actively working and actively helping build the park, especially in Southern California, had done some studies. And what social studies indicated is that typically a person will not walk more than 19 or 20 steps to throw away a piece of wrapper or something like that. So consequently, in a Disney park, if they're following their policies the way that Walt Disney had intended, you are never more than 19 steps away from a garbage container. Another question that I'll ask restaurants when I speak with them about waiting for official declarations of allergens, I'll ask, does anybody know how many lifeboats were on Titanic? And I don't tell them the answer right away. Of course, we all know how this story ends. Titanic had 20 lifeboats on board. What is interesting to me is that it was designed to carry 32 lifeboats, as you can see here in the highlighted section. But for aesthetic purposes, that number was reduced to 20. And again, we know tragically what happened at the end of that story. So let's not wait for official declarations. Let's try to act appropriately and anticipate potential concerns with food allergens. This and my next slide come from a training video. It's a out of date now training video that we have used historically with restaurants. There are more updated versions of this video now, but the pictures that you're going to see are just still pictures taken from those videos. So the first thing that we speak with people and with restaurants is to make sure that they're cleaning things thoroughly. And if you look closely on this table, you can see there's some peanut butter still on the tabletop, and this person is trying to wipe down that surface. Now in the full video, they don't do it correctly, and we use it as an example of what not to do when we're trying to clean things. But what I'm just trying to simply illustrate here is that we encourage people to clean food contact and non-food contact surfaces regularly and thoroughly, especially when they're dealing with foods that pose allergy concerns. Other times that we're encouraging people to clean and sanitize tables are items that we typically don't think about cleaning. For example, condiment bottles, salt and pepper shakers, things like this. In the bottom picture, you see a person using a sanitizing solution. Ideally, they've done so after they have used some kind of a detergent solution to clean that tabletop. But that's what we're asking restaurants to do when we talk about cleaning and sanitizing. Again, it should be a thorough cleanse and sanitize before a guest is seated at that table again. And that should happen all the time. It should, of course, be happening anytime between guests. Now, unfortunately, we recognize that sometimes it doesn't happen the way it should. But that's part of what my job is about, is to help restaurants understand the need to do this more frequently perhaps than they normally do. All right, I would like to use the chat button for just a little bit. I'd like you to think about these symbols here that are on your screen right now and ask, do you recognize what those symbols are? Do you, hopefully, if you can just give me a thumbs up or any kind of thing like that in the chat box or any kind of in the reaction. If you're, whoops, I'm sorry, I missed my screen here. Hang on. There we go. So you can give me a thumbs up if you're familiar with Zoom. There is a sometimes there's a button that allows you to express like a thumbs up or a hand clap or anything. I am seeing some things come through in chat, and I'm seeing many of you with the thumbs up. Excellent. Yes, and I'm seeing yeses. Fantastic. Thank you for that. I appreciate that. So as you're familiar, these are some of the international symbols for food allergens. Fortunately, we are starting to see the use of these being increased more in restaurants than they have in the past. Now, we are still waiting for the 2022 version of FDA's Model Food Code. Many states, most states across the country use the Model Food Code as the basis for their own food safety regulations. Retail food safety, I'll kind of go a little bit sidebar here. Retail food safety, so restaurants and grocery stores and convenience stores, things like that, is something that is delegated to the states. FDA, according to FDA, they do not have jurisdiction in restaurants. So they do publish a model food code that many states do use for their own state or local food safety regulations. We're still waiting for the 2022 version to come out, and now it's November 1st. We're getting a little bit nervous because FDA keeps telling us that they are going to publish it this year, but we're getting a little bit nervous because we're down to 60 some days left in the year. We do anticipate that sesame will be included in the 2022 Model Food Code as one of the major allergens. Currently, there are 8 major allergens listed in the United States Food Code. In Canada, there are a few other allergies listed, and you can see in these symbols, for example, celery is listed. Sesame is already listed in Canada. I believe mustard is listed in Canada. So these are just some of the international symbols that we see in use, and we encourage restaurants to continue to adopt the use of these kinds of symbols. I'd like you to think about this phrase. What does the phrase food safety culture mean? It's a phrase that's being used a lot in industry right now. It's actually being used now among the regulatory community. And I would like you to think about, what does that phrase mean? And oftentimes when I ask that question, be honest with you, I'm kind of met with a blank stare, and that's okay. So let's break this up a little bit. Think about where you work or what your home culture is like. What are some things that you regularly want to happen in your home or in your office where you work? And what does that culture look like? What are some things that are included? So if you want to include some things in the chat bar, go ahead and include some thoughts. And while you're doing that, I'm going to keep going ahead here. And I'd like you to think about, how do these things apply to food safety? There is a comment in the chat bar, shared values towards food safety. Absolutely. When we talk about shared values, what we have to really emphasize with restaurants is that's shared across the board. Every single person ultimately is responsible for food safety. So whether you're a front of the line worker, front of the house worker, and taking orders in a quick service restaurant, or whether you're an executive chef in the kitchen preparing remarkable meals, or maybe you're the owner of the restaurant who, doesn't deal with the day-to-day operations per se, but you're there to help staffing. Ultimately, everyone is still responsible for food safety culture. So yeah, shared values. And then we want to also apply that to, I am losing control on my slides. There we go. We also want to apply that to allergens, and how do allergens in the food impact the decisions that we make regarding food safety. And I have a few examples here. This is a rather tragic example, this one and the next one. This one was reported in the Washington Post in 2019. It's a case that comes out of the United Kingdom. If you can see, this is the best picture I could pull out of the Washington Post when this was published, and it only shows half of this young man's face. On his 18th birthday, this young man in the photo, in the black and white photo that you see, went to a restaurant and he told the servers he had a milk allergy, and it was a severe allergy. The restaurant then served him a chicken breast that had been marinated in buttermilk. Tragically, this young man did not survive this situation. The case did result in a several £1,000 legal settlement against the restaurant. But I'd like to look at a few factors and think about this concept of a food safety culture and the shared values that we ought to be employing when we think about food safety. Here are the investigation findings from that case. And I ask you to be the judge and ask yourself, were these shared values appropriately dealt with? First of all, according to the investigation, the menu did not mention any marinade or any other ingredients in that grilled chicken breast. It was simply on the menu as grilled chicken breast. Despite his alerting the server that he had a severe milk allergy, the server made no indication or mention that the chicken breast that he ordered was also marinated in buttermilk, nor did the server offer any other kind of alternative. And that's another thing that we talk about with restaurants is having an alternative menu item, perhaps, or alerting a guest to a particular menu item if there's an allergen in it, and maybe steering them, well, obviously steering them away from ordering that particular product. Now, the company indicated that their standards of communication with the guests were not met. Now, I noticed in the chat bar, there was a question that came in, where does the responsibility for this fall? Tragically, in this case, it fell with the restaurant. Remember, there was a several £1,000 legal settlement. In this case, the restaurant was sued. It was in the UK, so they used the pound as their monetary. I don't know the exact amount. There are many legal cases that have been filed in the United States for foodborne illness. Maybe not so much with allergies, but other foodborne illness situations. And ultimately, the responsibility lies with that restaurant that is serving the food. Now, let me go back to this restaurant in the UK, back to what the investigation found. Although the company indicated that their standards of communications were not met, they did argue that the allergy information was printed on the menu. However, it was at the very bottom of the menu in a very small font in black print on a royal blue background. Folks, I mentioned I grew up in the 1970s. Oftentimes when I'm looking at a computer screen, I have to wear, that's right, these right here, my readers, okay? I definitely have to wear them just to even see black print on a white background. If I go to a restaurant that's dimly lit, I have to wear my readers just so I can see the menu, and that's black on a white background. I don't believe personally that I would ever have noticed allergen information printed in black ink on a blue background. I believe that would be very difficult to see. And now the company disclaimer right now says, we will do our very best to accommodate you, but we cannot guarantee that our kitchens or our suppliers are 100% allergen free. Now, as the consumer, if you have a food allergen, you now have to make that determination. Do I eat at this restaurant or not? I have seen other restaurants, and I've told them that this is probably not the best statement they could come up with, but ultimately it's between them and their legal team. I have seen other restaurants say things in the United States. The one that really sticks out in my mind, I'm not going to name the restaurant, but it says, all of our food products have been exposed to every known allergen. And I thought, wow, that's meeting the letter of the law, but probably not the spirit of the law. However, that's a decision that they and their legal team had to make. So, all right. I don't know. Whoops, there we go. This was another tragic situation. This one happened a little bit too close to home. This happened in Eagle, Idaho, which is a suburb of Boise. I've never met with the mother of this young lady. I would like to, just to get some more information. But in this case, in May, she was a cheerleader. She went to a banquet at a cheerleading competition. The dessert that they ate contained nuts. She later had a reaction, an anaphylactic reaction, and tragically, this young lady did not survive. So this is stuff that's as you know, it's very serious. Okay. Now, another question that I pose to restaurants, and I would pose to you now, and again, if you have thoughts on this, please enter them in the chat box. What about the differences between someone with a food allergy versus a food sensitivity? Do you treat that differently? I'm just going to let that sit there for a question. That's that question. Let it sit there for a couple of minutes. Do you treat these differently? And I'd love to see some responses in the chat box. I'm good with silence for a while. Yes, thank you. That's the correct answer. No, you do not treat them the same. Why not? Well, actually, I do recommend that you do treat them the same as a food allergy. I'm sorry, I should have clarified on that. When you say no, that we don't treat these the same, just keep in mind that really the severity of some of these food allergies can be so quite severe that it's probably not the best idea to treat them differently. They should be treated the same as you would a food allergy. I have a niece, and I've never argued this with her. I've never asked her. She tells me that she is allergic to fish, and I take her at her word for that. So what I recommend though is that, like with fish, for example, there is an illness that can come about through temperature abused fish. I'm using some technical terms here. I'm sorry. This is fish that's been exposed to an elevated temperature. There is a compound on the surface of that fish. It depends on the species, but we do see this frequently with tuna, for example. If you have a tuna steak, if that tuna has been exposed during transport to an elevated temperature, there's a naturally occurring histidine on the surface of the fish that when temperature abused, that histidine converts to histamine, and now we have an allergic reaction or something that mimics an allergic reaction. And so I've never questioned my niece on whether or not she's actually allergic to fish, or did she just get some bad fish sometime? I don't know the answer to that question. In our family, we treat it the same. We tell her if there is going to be fish on a particular menu, and we keep that fish separate from other foods that we're cooking, and then she can have food that she knows has not been in touch with the fish. So my recommendation is to treat food allergies, and food sensitivities very much the same. And just make sure if a person even expresses that they have a food sensitivity, that you treat that the same way you would as you were cooking a food allergy food. There we go. All right, my screen is being delayed for some reason. Again, this is a presentation that we give to restaurants, and so it says there, our vice president of food science has an adult son. This is me we're talking about, my adult son. He was diagnosed at the age of 5 with a fairly severe tree nut allergy. Now, it's important that you understand what hidden ingredients might be in a food. So, for example, when my son was attending university, he attended once a formal dinner, and chocolate mousse was served as the dessert. He asked the servers if there were nuts in the mousse, and the servers all looked at the mousse and they all said no. They're just looking at it for a visual indication that there are nuts in there. They didn't see any. After 2 bites, he knew he was having an allergic reaction. He used his EpiPen, rushed off to the hospital. He was fine later on. But later he went back and he spoke with the executive chef who had prepared the meal, and he asked about the mousse. And this chef told him, oh yeah, on the mousse, I use a base of Nutella. Well, if you're familiar with Nutella, it's a lot of hazelnuts. It's like hazelnut butter with a lot of sugar and a lot of cocoa, and it's a very yummy product if you can eat it, but it does contain tree nuts, a lot of tree nuts. We've had a lot of conversations with restaurants, especially lately, about how it's important to demonstrate what the ingredients are. Now, some ingredients are clear to see, others are not. I've heard many, many times people kind of mockingly say things like, well, do we really have to say that there are peanuts in the peanut butter? Probably not. Some allergens aren't as easy to see as this pecan pie. Obviously, in fact, my son once asked me, he had been exposed to some walnuts once too. And again, he had to use his EpiPen and he was fine. But he asked me once, he said, Dad, what do pecans taste like? And I said, they're very similar to walnuts, only not quite as bitter. And he said, oh man, I bet I would love a pecan pie. And I said, yeah, you're probably right. You probably would really enjoy a pecan pie, but you can't have it because you're allergic to it. So not all allergens are as easily identified as what we're seeing with this pecan pie. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. Do you know that if a restaurant is serving an authentic Caesar salad with an authentic Caesar dressing, that dressing contains fish and it contains raw eggs? That's an authentic Caesar dressing, okay? So what some restaurants are now starting to do is they'll display the product and then they'll include what the ingredients are under that product. If you think back to that pecan pie, some restaurants are starting to show a picture of the item, like the picture of that pecan pie, and then state it, it's pecan pie. And I know, like I said, I've heard people kind of mockingly say, well, do we really need to disclose that? Probably not, but it's certainly not a bad idea to indicate to a person who has a food allergy that there might be something in that particular food that they don't want to consume. For example, Caesar dressing. Again, if they're making an authentic Caesar dressing. Just a few final thoughts before I conclude. As I mentioned, communication is critical. My advice is to never underestimate the severity of a food allergy. I encourage people to anticipate problems and be prepared for those problems. Again, don't wait for that official declaration. Don't wait for someone to tell you. Now, of course, the guest, of course, should be able to tell you if they have an allergy. And then the servers in a restaurant should be able to point to other food items or menu items and encourage them to choose other items. There's a note in the chat. I just want to look at this really quick. Yeah, it'd be more clear for a guest to specify tree nuts instead of saying, does this have nuts? And note the type of nuts. Yeah, that's a great point. It's really interesting because he can have peanut butter, my son. It is only the tree nuts that he's allergic to. He's adopted that question just out of, that's the way that he manages it. And he tends to avoid anything that has nuts unless he's made it himself and he knows that those nuts are peanuts or peanut butter or something like that. But I really appreciate the comment that you put in the chat. There's another one that just came in. I really do appreciate these comments. These are fantastic. Servers should always refer to back of house instead of answering the question themselves. That's a great point. We do actually recommend that restaurants have one person or more on staff who is well trained in food allergens and who can answer those specific questions. So great comments. I really appreciate them. You can see my contact information on this last slide. If you have any other questions or comments, I welcome your comments. The easiest way to get a hold of me is through my email. You see it right there on your screen. My boss is Larry Lynch. He's the Senior Vice President for Health and Safety. And so I report directly to Larry, but he can also answer many, many questions about food allergens. So with that, I thank you for your time. And I know that we have some time left over for questions and answers.
Yes, we sure do. Thank you so much, Patrick. That was very informative and interactive. I'm glad we were able to get the chat up and running. So we did have some questions come through. If a restaurant or location would like to start to change their culture, as you mentioned in the beginning, a lot of food safety culture in restaurants or in the hospitality industry is focused on, knife safety or making sure the food's a proper temperature, but now we're focusing on food allergies. So where do they start? Do they start with training your staff? Do they start with updating their menu? Do they start with checking their storeroom and procurement policies? Let's walk through a journey.
I love this question. A lot of times people think that it takes years and years to develop a strong food safety culture. It doesn't. I like the ancient Chinese proverb of a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And I use that same analogy when I talk about food safety culture with restaurants. It starts with one step. That you're concerned about temperature control, fantastic. Now take the next step and start to speak with your staff regularly about hygienic controls. Once you get that step, talk about another step. Include food allergens in these steps too. And so it can take time, that is true. But our advice to restaurants is also anything that you do to begin implementing a food safety culture is better than doing nothing at all. So take that first step. Start it with communicating with your staff the importance of food safety.
I think you're absolutely right. I think they have to understand just how important this is. And you were able to share a few examples of, what could happen when something does go wrong. Fatalities can happen. Children or guests or adults can be hospitalized. I know you shared your experience with your son. And so, I mean, this can be food allergies can be life-threatening.
It
And
can,
so,
and we have another food allergen that I didn't speak about very much. My wife, we discovered, is allergic to a coloring that is commonly used in vibrant reds. It's called cochineal extract, or carmine is another name for it. We discovered this because she had some ruby red grapefruit juice from a particular brand, and she got hives on her neck. And then a few weeks later, she changed eyeliners, and her eyes, the makeup on her caused her eyes to swell shut. And I did some research, and that was a common ingredient, and it is an allergen, I've discovered. So now that was not severe. I mean, we know how to deal with it. But here again, my wife, for example, if she goes to a restaurant and she sees a vibrant red coloring used in food, she'll ask, "What is your coloring?" And she has to know because she can't eat it.
wow, it's such an interesting journey to have had grapefruit juice and to apply makeup at different times, but to be able to identify a specific ingredient. And you're right, while in the US, there are 9 foods that make up 90% of food allergies. And for those on the call or those in the session, that's peanuts, tree nuts, milk, eggs, wheat, soy, sesame, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, wheat, soy, eggs, milk, and sesame. I missed milk. But you can be allergic to any food. You can be allergic to kiwi. You can be allergic to sesame. I mean, you can be allergic to strawberries. You can be allergic to red food dye coloring. It sounds like your wife is.
Yeah.
So do you have any tips for managing food allergies that may not be some of these common ones? I know you had some of the icons up that had, sulfites on there and mustard, which are allergens that are indicated on packages in other countries, not in the US.
Right.
But any tips on managing food allergies that may not be common, or that staff may not be aware of?
Yeah, the most important thing just goes back to that communication. If you're at a restaurant, I encourage guests of restaurants to express their food allergies. Let the servers know so that they can go to the back of the house and speak with the chef or the cooks and say, "Hey, we have a food allergy at this table, and so we need to make sure that we avoid, whatever that particular allergen is." So communication is key. The other thing, and I mean, I hate to say this, but this is sometimes the onus is on us to do some research, and that can be very difficult. When I discovered the carmine allergy, I had to research that, and the only thing that tipped us off was, we noticed a few weeks after she had the grapefruit juice that her eyes were swollen shut. And all I did was I went back and I did some research, and I discovered that this coloring was a common ingredient, and then I had to research that. And so, sometimes it's not really fair that the consumer has to do their own research. And yet that's another great tip to handle food allergies is make sure that you're well informed on what the allergy is and what it might be in as far as foods are concerned.
Yeah. And when in doubt, or don't guess.
Exactly. That's also obviously the most important thing. If you're not sure, don't order the food, don't eat the food.
Yeah. So we had a question come in from the chat box or from the
Okay.
Q&A box. This attendee works on a college campus, so a little bit outside of restaurants, but a lot of restaurants are now on college campuses, not the
Right.
traditional dining hall anymore, or only. And so due to widespread hiring shortage, we bring in a lot of temporary staff to keep dining halls running who may be here for a day, a month, a week, etc. Do you have any advice to help these temporary staff prepare and handle allergens in the kitchen?
I do. We with at the National Restaurant Association, and there are several other organizations also that publish posters and visual aids that you can post in the back of your house or in your food prep area to remind, especially in this case, temporary workers, to remind them these are food allergens, and just help them to be aware that what we've got foods, we've got these allergens. So when you're preparing these, just be aware of that. Again, communication is going to be key. Having a person who is regularly and well trained in how to deal with food allergens, kind of in a supervisory role, can also greatly help, especially with temporary staff. Just monitor what they're doing. But yes, there are tools that are out there. So I would certainly encourage you to consider something like that.
Yeah, and FAIR is one of those other organizations that
Absolutely.
that publishes back of house training materials. We have our FAIR Check training, which is a live instructor-led training, but also on demand. And we do have some printable resources, PDFs, posters that you can also download on our
Yeah.
website. So thank you for promoting us without even promoting us. Yeah. Along that same line, along that same thread of thought, she mentions hiring shortages, but there also have been a lot of supply chain issues. Any advice on how to manage food allergies when there are, issues in procurement and ordering and receiving?
Yeah, boy, this is so difficult, and whoever has expressed this is so correct. We're continuing to see all kinds of supply issues. The best advice that I could give you is to communicate with those suppliers. Make sure as their supplier, you have the ability as the restaurant to set your standards. You have the ability to say to the supplier, if you can't guarantee my standards, I can't accept your product. So make sure that they are aware of what your standards are, and make sure they're following their own standards as well. They are supposed to follow the same food safety standards as anybody else in terms of cross-contamination, cross-contact with allergens, temperature control, hygienic controls. They're supposed to follow all of those same things that any restaurant is supposed to follow. So just ask, you can ask, but just make sure that they're following their own standards too. So, and again, you have the ability to say, these are my standards. You need to meet these. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I, in the last couple of minutes, I do want to pose a question to you that we posed to our panelists before, since you had mentioned yourself, you do have food allergies. And since dining out, you may dine out for events, whether it's birthday party, a wedding, maybe a catered event. So dining out can be challenging. Have food allergies affected any choices or events in your life?
Yes. Short answer is yes. That same son, he worked when he was in high school during the summer times. He worked at a Boy Scout camp, and this is how he got exposed to walnuts. They have this common dining hall, and one morning he went in, and somebody before him in the line had removed or knocked over the signs on the cinnamon rolls. They were labeled as, these cinnamon rolls have walnuts, these don't. But by the time he got up to those cinnamon rolls in the line, he didn't see that sign, and so he had a cinnamon roll that had walnuts in it. As a result, he had to practice a lot more caution in that. I can also tell you that there are certain brands of foods that we will not purchase because we know that it has that coloring, for example, that my wife is allergic to. There are certain things that she just won't eat. Because another thing about carmine, I don't want to go into great detail because I know we're almost out of time, but it is derived from a natural source. And so on a food label, it can say natural colorings instead of disclosing that it is carmine or cochineal extract. So when she sees something that says natural colorings and it's a bright, vibrant red, she tends to not purchase that product, and she'll look for something that's an alternative. Another interesting thing I just reminded me of. There's a common antibiotic that is used called amoxicillin. Amoxicillin is typically colored with carmine. So my wife cannot use amoxicillin, the tablet forms of amoxicillin. She has to get a different antibiotic if she ever has to go onto an antibiotic regimen. Yeah.
Wow. And we don't have time to talk about antibiotics or
Right.
personal care products, but I appreciate you bringing that up, because you're so right that food has found its way into so many other products. And while you're a restaurant location, you're not, selling lotions and you're not dispensing medication like amoxicillin in your restaurant, but your staff may have applied, hand lotion that day, or your staff may have used products in their hair, or they may have, touched something and then touched their phone and then they went into work. And I know hand washing is supposed to be a common practice, and it
Supposed to
absolutely
be.
should be. It absolutely should be, but it's just showing you that it may not be food that can be causing reactions, because if food has found its way into many personal care products, and personal care products and medications aren't labeled.
Yep. Yeah, you're so right. And it's so disheartening that some of these allergies are as severe as they are, and we as consumers have to keep our toes, keep up on our toes. I'll go back to that quote that I used at the beginning of my presentation. It can be exhausting. It is always at the front of your mind, and sometimes that's not fair to the consumer, but that's the world we live in, unfortunately. So
yeah, but that's all we have for today with Patrick. Thank you so much for you and to everyone that joined this session. Be sure to join us for our next and final session of today, which is navigating the hospitality industry with multiple lenses, in about 15 minutes. So
thank you for the
so much.
opportunity. It was my pleasure to be with you today.
Excellent. Hope to work with you again in the future, and see everyone shortly.
All right, take care.